In the gospel reading for today, we're given what's known as just the first part of the little apocalypse of the Gospel of Mark, the little unveiling of the end times given by Jesus to his disciples as they wander among the great temple, admiring the large stones and the building that comprised that structure, a structure that really was one of the great wonders of the ancient world. And Jesus tells his disciples that the entire temple will be destroyed. His disciples naturally are kind of curious as to when this is going to happen, hopefully after we leave. Jesus tells them not to be led astray, that many will pretend that they are the second coming of Christ, and he tells them, don't believe them. Because there's going to be wars, there'll be rumors of wars, there'll be upheaval in creation, there'll be natural disasters, but these don't mean we're at the end, he says. Jesus says these are but the beginnings of the birth pangs. Now, I would imagine that most of the Christians here gathered in this space, we hear Jesus tell his disciples that all the horrible things going on should not be taken as markers of the end times, and we kind of breathe a sigh of relief. After all, Episcopalians aren't generally known to be the sort of Christians who get very excited about end times theology. Good organ music? Ooh, give it to me. But the end of the world, I just think we'll let other people talk about that. And so we kind of like the way, I think, this gospel seems to be a rebuke to anyone who looks at what's going on and says, see, the end is here. We say, Jesus said you can't tell. But that's not actually what Jesus said, right? We know that. What Jesus said, he doesn't say that the upheaval in the world has nothing to do with the end times. He just says it's the beginning of the birth pangs. And I discovered when Bethany and I had Lucy that the beginning of like in the movies, like your water breaks and then a baby comes, like that. It does not. It takes longer. I don't know if you know this. Much longer. I may have napped during some of it. While she had gotten the little needle in the back, and we were both supposed to sleep, and I actually did, and I snored. And she tried to throw things at me, but she was paralyzed from the waist down and couldn't get to me. And yet we're still married. This is love, true love. Amen. No, I'm kidding. That's not... Sorry, I went off script a little bit. The birth pangs. So what Jesus is saying is that military and ecological upheaval is a part of, the beginning part of, the coming final upheaval that will end all things. Upheaval is a reminder that you and I live in a world that is tenuous, that is marred by violence, that God will not allow, though, this sort of world to continue forever. The end will come, Jesus tells us very clearly, even though many of us would kind of rather stick our fingers in our ears and close our eyes, trying very hard not to think what the end of all things must mean. But the end will come nonetheless, Jesus tells us. Interestingly enough, that word Jesus uses in this gospel reading, translated as birth pangs, in the Greek it's the word odinon. Odinon. And then later on in the same apocalypse, in verse 19 of this chapter, Jesus uses another word that has a similar meaning that can also be translated as birth pangs. The Greek people were smart enough to give, go ahead, 2 words to that experience. They also used the word thlipsis. Thlipsis, a word that is often translated as suffering or anguish. Thlipsis, birth pangs. And that word thlipsis also shows up in the first reading for today from the book of Daniel. When the Lord speaks to Daniel in a vision, he says, there will be a time of anguish, of thlipsis, in the Greek translation of Daniel, in the Septuagint. In both Mark 13 and Daniel 12, God is saying that the suffering, upheaval, and turmoil of the present world is like the pain of childbirth. That is, God is telling us that through this upheaval that we all experience, God is seeking to give birth to a new world. It's unfortunate we're only given the first 3 verses of chapter 12 of Daniel in today's readings, but these verses are actually the climax of what's gone before. You know Daniel, right? You know the story of Daniel in the lion's den. That's probably all many of us think of when we think of Daniel. That's the first part of Daniel, chapters 1 through 6. The story of Daniel, a Jew who lived in the Babylonian exile, who rose to a prominent position in the government, and then a law went out saying you've got to worship the emperor, and Daniel said, and still worshiped God. He didn't actually say, that's in the Hebrew. That is, no, I'm joking. Daniel said no, still worshiped God, and got thrown into a lion's den, and God saved Daniel from the lion's den. We know this Sunday school. It's a horrible story to tell kids in Sunday school, I have to say. I had nightmares about thrown in a dark pit with lions. Yes, children, so love God. But that's just actually the first part of, that's actually only half of the book of Daniel. I don't know if you know that, because chapter 7 through the rest of Daniel, which goes, I think, to chapter 13, the second half of the book is a series of visions of the end of the world and what will lead to the end of the world. In the second half of Daniel, Daniel uses this rich and violent imagery to portray the work of God to overthrow evil, particularly the evil that Daniel and the other exiles are experiencing. So the book of Daniel, though, wasn't written during the Babylonian exile. Most scholars think the book of Daniel was written in the 2nd century BC. And during that time of suffering, that the Jews were looking back to their memories of Daniel and the time of exile. And so they wrote this story down to remind themselves and comfort themselves, because in the 2nd century BC, the world had gotten very dark for the Jewish people. Antiochus was the great empire, the great king of the Greeks. Antiochus' original name was Mithridates. But when he assumed the throne of the Greek empire, he took a new name. He said, now I will be known as Antiochus Epiphanes, a phrase that means God manifest. I am so grateful that our country does not have a custom of giving yourself a new name when you become president. I can only imagine the kind of names we'd be getting. But that's the thing for the Greeks. Antiochus, God manifest. And so Antiochus had been forced out of Egypt in a battle, and on his way through, going back up to Greece, he went through Judah, because there was a civil war going on in Judah between Hellenistic Jews who were friendly with the Greek Empire and those Jews who were resisting the influence of Greece. Antiochus and his mercenaries came, and they plundered the city of Jerusalem. They slaughtered women and children, young and old. Because Antiochus thought the whole problem was this backwards Jewish religion, he desecrated the temple. He took a pig, unclean animal for Judaism, and he slaughtered it on the altar in the temple as a sacrifice to Zeus. The Jews know this as the abomination of desolation. And then he outlawed all aspects of the Jewish religion. No more circumcision, no more Sabbath, no more festivals, none of it. You're all done. So it's in that experience that the 2nd century Jews are trying to remember the story of their exile in Babylon, of Daniel's faithfulness, and of the truth that eventually the Babylonian Empire fell, and then the Persian Empire fell, and now it's the Greek Empire, but it's going to fall too, and then the Roman Empire, to remind themselves that empires rise and fall, but God's steadfast love will always be with God's people. Right up until at the end, God finally makes all of this right, because they want so desperately for it finally to be made right. And so that's what Daniel does in the visions in the second part of the book. He goes through these visions of empires rising and falling as the power and love of God continues to move forward. And then it culminates in chapter 12 that we get in the reading for today, when the archangel Michael arises to finally defeat evil in the world and deliver God's people. But did you notice how Michael was described not as an angel in this text? It was the great prince, the protector of your people. See, this is what apocalyptic literature does. It uses symbols to subvert the narrative of the world and of the time. Michael means in Hebrew, who is like God. So by saying to this Greek king who declares himself God manifest, that actually what's going to happen is a different prince is going to arise with the name of, wait, who is it that's like God? And will put Antiochus and all other despots in the world down so that justice will truly reign. In this text, Antiochus is being taunted by the Jewish people who know who the real God is. And Daniel does this throughout the visions. A lot of this section of Daniel is the same style of story that would be told by empires and kingdoms to support the narrative that these horrible things happen, but then I become king and all is made right. Daniel's using the exact same type of story, but to describe the downfall of kingdoms and the rising and lifting up of the poor and the oppressed by the power of God. He's subverting the narrative of the day. Now, you and I might just think that this is a very interesting and kind of odd book written to give hope to a Jewish people who had experienced generations of violence, that that's kind of all it is. But I'd invite you to take a few steps back and consider the problems that Daniel is addressing. The book of Daniel is speaking to a world where the holy and sacred is overrun by violence, by those with a thirst for power and control. He's speaking to a world where the violence of nations seems about to consume the face of the earth. And in our own days, when armed, angry men enter churches to shoot down those gathered. In our days, when much of the kingdom, much of the government seems to be working only for the further enrichment of the wealthy, not for all the people who are struggling. In our days, where the desire for the victory of our country leads to acts of profound violence upon people around the world, leads to the neglect of suffering people at our very borders. I think in this day and age, Daniel's actually remarkably, maybe even unsettlingly relevant. Because Daniel insists that the world you and I are experiencing right now, that though it's terrifying at times, that this does not mean God is not still in control and at work in the midst of the terror. Daniel, in all apocalyptic literature, urges us not to trust in the nation to make things right, not to trust in our own wealth to protect us, not to trust in violence so that we will win and be made secure, not to trust in any of these things for our salvation. Instead, the book of Daniel invites us to have courage, to have faith, and to remember that the love of God is at work even in the darkest of times, working to bring about justice for the oppressed and the suffering. Have faith. God's love will also overthrow this in the end, just like God's love has overthrown all other evil throughout time. But Daniel's not just speaking a word of comfort. Apocalyptic literature is this great thing. It's kind of like a good sermon. It does comfort the afflicted, but it also is intended to afflict the comfortable. So Daniel is trying to poke you in the ribs just a little, to make you feel a little uncomfortable, by asking if you think your life has more to do with the power of the empire, or if your life has more to do with what the love of God is trying to do in the world. Daniel's asking if you live your life comfortable, relatively comfortable, with the powers that oppress and dehumanize others. I mean, you'll complain about it on Facebook, but you know, do you do more? Daniel wants to know if you are one of the wise. That's what he says, right? He says, in the end, all who sleep will arise, some to everlasting life, some to everlasting contempt. And then those who arise, that they'll shine like the brightness of the sky, that these are those who are wise, the ones who will arise to everlasting life. But interesting, the Hebrew form of the word wise, sakal is the word, sakal, but the form of sakal that Daniel uses is the hifil form. I know you're fascinated. Let me explain why that's important. The hifil form is the causative form of the word. So it's not actually those who are wise, it's those who cause others to be wise. Daniel is saying that those who are saved in the end, those who shine like the brightness of the sky, are those who bring wisdom to others. Those who, in Daniel's word, lead many to righteousness, lead many to justice. So if you look around you at the world and you feel disturbed at times, if you're tempted to just turn off the news, change the channel, block everything unpleasant on Facebook, and retreat into the comfort of your own life, Daniel would urge you not to. Because comfort is a tremendous seducer of God's people, getting them out of doing the work of God in this world. And in fact, any form of Christianity that reads apocalyptic literature and says that the response of the faithful in a time of evil is to retreat into the back, stay together, safe and sound, and wait for God to come fix it all, that's a huge, massive misuse of the apocalyptic in Scripture. Rather, when you feel disturbed by what's around you, ask yourself how God's love may be at work even in this. Ask what faithfulness to that love looks like in the face of this evil. Because when you read apocalyptic literature, you discover that faithfulness in the face of evil very rarely will leave you in a comfortable place. And so if you like your comfortable place that you live in right now, I'm so sorry. Because faithfulness in the face of evil always leads to places of discomfort, where you stand up and step out of your comfortable places on behalf of the right, on behalf of the poor, on behalf of the oppressed. Hear Daniel's insistence that the love of God will overcome the injustices of this world, will overcome the horrors of our own time. But also know that because the love of God is a just love, that means that which is high will be brought low. And ask yourself where you're going to show up when the love of God arrives to do God's work. Whether you will be that doing the overthrowing, or whether you are going to wind up with that which God must overthrow so that all people in this world can experience love and justice. Because make no mistake, as much as we want to close our eyes and plug our ears, we will all be awakened on the last day. The question is, what will we awaken to? Will we awaken, in the words of Daniel, to shame? Shame for all the times we compromised and went along. Shame for the time we remained silent. Shame for the time we held on to our own possessions and comfort and security instead of doing something in the face of what this world has. Or will we awaken to everlasting life that isn't just this idea of a life that never ends, but everlasting life in the Hebrew world is a life that's constantly growing and expanding so that all people are brought into the shalom and peace and wholeness of the love of God. Will we awaken to that kind of growing life and love that is shared among all people on this earth? I know what we all hope we will awaken to. And God's love in the end, I believe, will heal all that is broken, will even heal that which is evil. But there will be some things brought down first, and some things raised up first. And when you awaken on that last day, what will you awaken